The Silk Road was never silent. Merchants spoke of thunder without clouds, footsteps in empty dunes, and winds that carried words no living tongue could speak. But among all the legends whispered around caravan fires, one stood apart, a tale so consistent across centuries that even skeptics grew uneasy. Turkish traders, hardened by years of desert crossings, swore they heard her, a woman singing in the deep night, her voice so beautiful it pulled men from their saddles, so haunting it left camels frozen in terror. They called her the Desert Widow. Some said she mourned a lost husband. Others claimed she was never human at all. By the time the first European explorers arrived, entire trade routes had been abandoned. The question wasn't whether she existed. It was whether anyone who heard her song ever truly escaped. The earliest recorded account comes from a Turkish merchant named Demirhan, who documented his travels along the Eastern Silk Road in 1347. His journal, discovered in a forgotten archive in Samarkand, describes an event that would become the foundation of the Desert Widow legend. Demirhan's caravan had been traveling for 11 days through the Taklamakan Desert when, on the 12th night, everything changed. "We made camp near the ruins of an old shrine," he wrote. "The men were restless. The camels would not settle. Then, as the moon rose, we heard it, a woman's voice, singing in a language none of us recognized. It was not loud, but it carried across the sands as if the desert itself was singing. Two of my men stood up and began walking toward the sound. I shouted at them. They did not respond. Their eyes were open, but they saw nothing." Demirhan's account is chilling not because of what it describes, but because of what came after. He notes that the two men who heard the song most clearly refused to speak for 3 days. When they finally did, both told the same story. They had seen a woman standing at the edge of the firelight, dressed in white robes that moved against a wind that wasn't blowing. She was beautiful, they said, but her eyes were empty. And her song was not meant to comfort. It was meant to call. This was not an isolated incident. Between the 14th and 16th centuries, at least 24 similar reports surfaced from merchants traveling the same region. The descriptions varied slightly. Some said she appeared near ruins, others claimed she emerged from sandstorms, but the core elements remained identical. A woman, a song, men compelled to follow, and a deep, unshakable sense that whatever she was not offering salvation. Ottoman records from the 1580s reveal that certain routes through the Taklamakan were officially discouraged by trade guilds. Caravans that insisted on traveling those paths often returned smaller than they left. When survivors were questioned, many refused to speak. Those who did mentioned the same thing. They heard singing in the night, and some of their men walked into the desert and never came back. But the mystery deepens when we examine the linguistic evidence. Several merchants noted that the song was not in Turkish, Persian, or Chinese, the dominant languages of the Silk Road. In 1612, a Venetian trader named Giacomo Bellini claimed he recognized fragments of the melody. He said it resembled an ancient Tocharian funeral chant, a language that had been dead for nearly 1,000 years by the time he heard it. If you want the truth behind this mystery to reach more people, hit like, so the investigation goes deeper. The Tocharians were a mysterious Indo-European people who lived in the Tarim Basin, the same region where the Desert Widow sightings occurred. They left behind mummies, textiles, and fragments of written language, but very little is known about their religious practices. What we do know is that they buried their dead in elaborate rituals, often near shrines in remote desert locations. Could the Desert Widow be connected to these ancient burial sites? Was she a ghost of the Tocharian people, still performing a ritual that outlasted her civilization? The theory gained traction in the 19th century when archaeologists began unearthing Tocharian mummies in the Taklamakan Desert. Many of these burial sites were found near the same locations where merchants reported hearing the singing. In 1904, A German expedition led by Albert von Lecoq discovered a mummified woman in a tomb near Subashi. She was dressed in white robes, her hands positioned as if holding something that was no longer there. The tomb had been disturbed multiple times over the centuries, and the walls bore strange markings, repeated symbols that resembled musical notation. Von Lecoq noted in his field journal that the local guides refused to enter the tomb after sunset. When pressed, they said the site was cursed. Von Lecoq dismissed the superstition, but 2 members of his team reported hearing faint singing on the night they camped near the tomb. What makes the Desert Widow legend so compelling is its persistence. Unlike many cryptid or ghost stories that fade as modernization spreads, reports of the singing woman continued well into the 20th century. In 1932, a Chinese archaeological team working near Lulan documented strange audio phenomena, low-frequency sounds that seemed to form patterns resembling human vocalization. They initially attributed it to wind passing through rock formations, but later analysis suggested the sounds were too structured to be purely natural. Comment: evidence. If you believe this part of the story shouldn't be forgotten. By the 1950s, the area had become politically sensitive, and access was restricted. The few reports that emerged from Soviet and Chinese expeditions were heavily redacted, but rumors persisted. In 1978, a declassified Soviet document mentioned auditory anomalies near ancient burial sites in the Taklamakan, noting that personnel experienced disorientation and compulsive behavior when exposed to these sounds for extended periods. The Desert Widow had moved from folklore to something that governments felt the need to investigate. But the question remained, what was she? Was she a ghost, bound to the desert by grief or ritual? A psychological phenomenon triggered by isolation and the harsh environment? Or something else entirely? Something that used the form of a woman and the beauty of a song to lure the living into the same fate that claimed her? To understand the Desert Widow, we must first understand the desert itself. The Taklamakan is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Both interpretations are accurate. For centuries, the desert swallowed cities, caravans, and entire populations. The Silk Road did not pass through the Taklamakan by choice. It passed through because there was no other way to connect east and west. The desert's extreme conditions create natural phenomena that can deceive the senses. Mirages are common. Temperature inversions can distort sound, making distant noises seem close and directional. Sand dunes, when wind passes over them at certain speeds, produce low-frequency vibrations that some researchers have linked to feelings of unease, disorientation, and even hallucinations. Could the Desert Widow simply be a combination of these natural effects, interpreted through the lens of exhausted, fearful travelers? Dr. Elena Kuznetsova, a geophysicist who studied the Taklamakan in the 1990s, proposed that the singing might be a form of acoustic phenomenon known as desert hum, a sustained, low-frequency sound produced by wind interacting with specific geological formations. Her team recorded several instances of this hum near ancient ruins, and in some cases, the sound patterns bore an eerie resemblance to human vocalization. But Kuznetsova also acknowledged the limitations of this explanation. The hum can explain the sound, she said in a 2003 interview, but it cannot explain the consistency of the reports. Why do so many witnesses describe a woman? Why do they report seeing her, not just hearing her? To answer these questions, we must look at the cultural and historical context. The Silk Road was not just a trade route. It was a conduit for ideas, beliefs, and fears. Every culture that traveled it brought its own myths, and those myths blended and evolved over time. The concept of a dangerous female spirit who lures men to their deaths is not unique to the Taklamakan. Similar figures appear in Greek mythology, the sirens, Slavic folklore, the rusalka, and Middle Eastern legends, the ghoul. But the Desert Widow has a specificity that these other legends lack. She is always described as a widow, not simply a female spirit. She is always associated with mourning, not malice. And she is always connected to a specific place, not the entire desert, but particular locations, usually near ruins or burial sites. This suggests that the legend may have a historical origin, a real person or event that was later mythologized. One candidate is Queen Lulan, a semi-legendary figure from the ancient kingdom of Lulan, which thrived in the Tarim Basin around 200 BCE. According to Chinese records, Queen Lulan was renowned for her beauty and her voice. She was said to sing during religious ceremonies, and her songs were believed to have the power to communicate with the dead. When the kingdom collapsed, possibly due to environmental changes that dried up the region's water sources, Queen Lulan disappeared. Some accounts say she died in the desert, searching for water to save her people. Others claim she was betrayed and murdered. Type: yes. If you want us to follow every clue until the very end. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of Lulan as a real place. The ruins of the city were discovered in 1900 by Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, and excavations revealed a sophisticated urban center with advanced irrigation systems, temples, and burial grounds. In one of the tombs, researchers found a female mummy, later dubbed the Beauty of Lulan, whose preservation was so remarkable that her facial features were still recognizable. She was dressed in fine clothing and buried with objects suggesting high status. Could this be the Desert Widow? The timeline is provocative. The kingdom of Lulan declined around the same time that the Silk Road began to expand through the region. If Queen Lulan did die in the desert, her story could have been passed down through generations of travelers, evolving into the legend we know today. The connection to singing, mourning, and ruins all align with the historical context. But there is a problem with this theory. The Desert Widow is not benevolent. Queen Lulan, according to legend, was a compassionate ruler who sacrificed herself for her people. The Desert Widow, by contrast, is dangerous. She does not guide travelers to safety. She leads them to their deaths. This suggests that something darker may have been added to the legend over time, or that the figure travelers encountered was never Queen Lulan at all. In the 17th century, a Persian scholar named Nasr al-Din al-Tusi documented a version of the Desert Widow story that included a crucial detail. The widow was not mourning her husband. She was mourning her children, who died of thirst in the desert. In her grief, she made a pact with a jinn, a spirit of the desert, to remain in the sands forever, singing to attract travelers so that she would never be alone. According to al-Tusi, the jinn granted her wish, but at a cost. Anyone who heard her song would feel compelled to join her, becoming part of the desert itself. This version of the legend introduces an important element: the idea that the Desert Widow is not simply a ghost, but something transformed by bargaining with supernatural forces. It suggests that she is not entirely human, or at least not anymore. This interpretation aligns more closely with the experiences of travelers who often describe the widow as beautiful but wrong, her movements too smooth, her voice too perfect, her presence too still. Share this video so others know how deep this mystery actually goes. The challenge with investigating a legend that spans centuries is separating genuine encounters from embellished stories, cultural contamination, and outright fabrication. But the Desert Widow legend has something that many cryptid tales lack: physical evidence that demands explanation. The first piece of evidence comes from cartography. Historical maps of the Silk Road, particularly those created by Ottoman and Persian geographers, show deliberate route diversions in the Taklamakan region. These detours add days, sometimes weeks, to travel time, yet they were widely adopted by merchant guilds. Why would experienced merchants, for whom time and profit were paramount, choose longer, more dangerous routes? The answer is simple. They believed the risk of encountering the Desert Widow was greater than the risk of extended travel. The second piece of evidence is biological. In 1952, a Soviet expedition investigating ancient Silk Road sites near Moran reported finding the remains of several bodies buried in shallow graves outside a ruined caravanserai. The bodies were not ancient. Carbon dating suggested they died between 1870 and 1920. What made the discovery unusual was the condition of the remains. All of the individuals showed signs of severe dehydration and exposure, but their positions were identical, lying face down, arms extended forward, as if they had been crawling toward something. The Soviet report noted that the graves were located approximately 3 kilometers from the nearest water source, in the opposite direction from the caravan route. There was no logical reason for these individuals to have traveled in that direction. The report concluded that they had likely become disoriented, but it offered no explanation for why multiple people, over a span of decades, would make the same fatal error in the same location. More disturbingly, personal effects found with the bodies included journals and letters. One letter, written in Turkish and dated 1891, described hearing a woman singing in the ruins the night before the writer disappeared. Another journal, in Persian, mentioned the widow's call multiple times in the final entries. The last entry read, "I must go to her." The third piece of evidence is acoustic. In 2001, a team of French ethnomusicologists traveled to the Taklamakan to record traditional music from the region's minority populations. While working near the Subashi ruins, they captured something on their equipment that they could not explain. A sustained vocal pattern, female in character, that appeared on recordings made over 3 consecutive nights. The pattern was not continuous, but it repeated at irregular intervals, always between midnight and 3 a.m. When analyzed, the vocal pattern showed characteristics inconsistent with natural sound phenomena. The pitch was too stable, the rhythm too deliberate. Dr. Marie-Claude Baudin, who led the expedition, stated in her published report, "We cannot conclusively say this is a human voice, but we also cannot explain it as wind, animal calls, or equipment malfunction." If this detail surprised you, comment "unexplained" below. The fourth piece of evidence is neurological. In 2014, a Chinese documentary crew filming in the Taklamakan for a series on Silk Road history reported that 3 crew members experienced identical symptoms after spending a night near the Lulan ruins: auditory hallucinations, compulsive behavior, and short-term memory loss. All 3 claimed they heard singing, though no singing was captured on any of their recording equipment. Medical examinations conducted after they were evacuated showed no evidence of drug use, dehydration, or psychological disorders. What makes this case particularly intriguing is that the crew members were experienced professionals, accustomed to working in remote and stressful environments. They had no prior knowledge of the Desert Widow legend, as the production team had deliberately avoided sharing local folklore to prevent bias in their filming. Yet their descriptions of the singing, the compulsion to follow it, and the appearance of a woman in white matched historical accounts almost perfectly. Dr. Han Wei, a neurologist consulted on the case, proposed that the symptoms could be the result of infrasound exposure. Infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, can cause feelings of unease, dread, and disorientation. It has been linked to reports of hauntings and paranormal experiences. The geology of the Taklamakan, particularly near the ruins, could theoretically produce infrasound under certain wind conditions. But this explanation, while plausible, does not account for the specificity of the hallucinations. Why do multiple people, across different time periods and cultures, hallucinate the same figure? Why is she always a woman in white? Why is she always associated with singing? Infrasound can explain the feeling, but not the vision. Not everyone believes the Desert Widow is supernatural. Skeptics have proposed a range of alternative explanations, each attempting to rationalize the legend through science, psychology, or cultural transmission. But as with all enduring mysteries, the counter-theories often raise as many questions as they answer. The most common skeptical explanation is mass hysteria. Proponents of this theory argue that the Desert Widow legend is a culturally transmitted narrative that travelers expected to encounter, and that expectation shaped their perception of natural events. In high-stress environments like the Taklamakan Desert, where isolation, exhaustion, and fear are constant companions, the brain is prone to pattern recognition errors. A distant sound becomes a voice. A shadow becomes a figure. A natural compulsion to explore becomes an uncontrollable urge to follow. Dr. Richard Moss, a psychologist specializing in mass hysteria events, studied the Desert Widow legend in the 1980s. According to Moss, the reason the descriptions are so consistent is not because people are encountering the same entity, but because they have been told the same story and are unconsciously conforming to its narrative structure. But this explanation struggles to account for the earliest reports, which predate widespread literacy and cross-cultural communication in the region. How did Turkish, Persian, Chinese, and European travelers all independently arrive at the same narrative details? And why does the legend remain consistent even among individuals who claim they had no prior knowledge of it? A second theory, proposed by environmental scientists, focuses on toxic exposure. The Taklamakan Desert has high concentrations of naturally occurring alkaline dust, heavy metals, and other compounds that can affect neurological function when inhaled over prolonged periods. Could the symptoms attributed to the Desert Widow, disorientation, hallucinations, memory loss, be the result of toxic exposure rather than supernatural influence? There is some evidence to support this. Samples taken from the regions where sightings are most common do show elevated levels of certain neurotoxic compounds. However, these compounds typically require sustained exposure to produce noticeable effects, and most caravan travelers spent only a few nights in any given location. Additionally, the symptoms reported by Desert Widow witnesses, specifically the auditory hallucinations and compulsive behavior, do not align perfectly with known toxic exposure profiles. A third theory is more provocative, that the Desert Widow is a form of psychological warfare. According to this theory, the legend was deliberately spread by local populations or rival merchant groups to discourage traffic through certain routes, thereby controlling trade and resources. In this interpretation, the sightings were not supernatural encounters but staged events, actors dressed in white, hidden sound sources, and perhaps even the use of drugs or suggestion to create the desired effect. This theory has some historical precedent. There are documented cases of trade routes being sabotaged through deception and fear tactics. However, the logistical challenges of maintaining such a deception over centuries across multiple cultures and political regimes seem insurmountable. And it does not explain the modern sightings, which occurred long after the Silk Road ceased to be economically significant. Perhaps the most unsettling counter-theory comes from anthropologist Dr. Lina Kurosawa, who proposed in 2008 that the Desert Widow is not a ghost, but a survivor. Kurosawa suggests that the legend may have originated from real women, widows, exiles, or refugees who lived in the desert ruins and used singing to attract travelers, either for help, companionship, or to lure victims for robbery. Over time, as these women died and their presence faded, the memory of them merged with supernatural explanations, creating the myth we know today. Kurosawa's theory is chilling because it reframes the Desert Widow not as a spirit, but as a desperate human being whose story was erased and replaced with something monstrous. It forces us to ask, how many legends are built on the graves of forgotten people? And if the Desert Widow was once real, what happened to the women who lived and died in the desert, alone and unnamed? If you want more unsolved history, comment your theory, and subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. The investigation into the Desert Widow took an unexpected turn in 2016 when a team of archaeologists from Xinjiang University uncovered a burial site near the ruins of Miran that would change the trajectory of the legend. The site, which had been partially exposed by shifting sands, contained not one but 17 bodies, all female, all buried in white cloth, all positioned facing west toward the setting sun. Carbon dating placed the burials between 400 and 600 CE during a period of significant upheaval in the region. The bodies showed signs of violent death, blunt force trauma, evidence of binding, and were buried without the usual grave goods or ceremonial objects. This was not a normal burial. It was a mass grave. Dr. Zhang Wei, who led the excavation, noted something else unusual. Several of the skulls showed evidence of trepanation, a surgical procedure in which a hole is drilled into the skull. In ancient times, trepanation was performed for various reasons: to relieve pressure, to treat head injuries, or, in some cultures, as part of religious rituals meant to allow spirits to enter or exit the body. But the trepanation marks on these skulls were not clean surgical cuts. They were rough, post-mortem, and located in nearly identical positions on each skull. The implication was disturbing. Someone had altered these bodies intentionally, perhaps to prevent the spirits from returning. The burial site also contained fragments of pottery, inscribed with Tocharian script. This discovery introduced a new possibility: that the Desert Widow was not one woman, but many. That the legend had grown from the collective memory of a group of women, possibly priestesses, oracles, or political prisoners, who were executed and buried in the desert, their voices silenced to prevent them from wielding whatever power they once held. And if the trepanations were performed to keep their spirits from escaping, it suggests that the people who buried them believed those spirits were dangerous. Zhang's findings were published in an academic journal in 2017, but the full report was never made publicly available. According to sources within the university, the Chinese government classified portions of the excavation under cultural heritage protection laws, citing concerns about grave robbing and tourism disruption. But rumors circulated that the decision was motivated by something else. Reports that excavation team members had experienced the same symptoms associated with Desert Widow encounters: auditory hallucinations, disorientation, and compulsive behavior toward the burial site. One team member, whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, allegedly left a voice recording describing what they experienced. A transcript of the recording, leaked online in 2018, reads, "We heard it on the third night. Not one voice, many. Layered, harmonizing, like a choir. It came from inside the tomb. We tried to record it, but the equipment failed. 2 of us went back in to check. When they came out, they wouldn't stop humming. They said they had to finish the song." Whether this account is genuine or fabricated is impossible to verify, but it aligns disturbingly well with historical reports. If accurate, it suggests that the Desert Widow phenomenon is not tied to a single spirit, but to a location, a place where something traumatic and powerful occurred, leaving an imprint that continues to affect those who come too close. What is the Desert Widow? After examining centuries of reports, physical evidence, cultural context, and scientific theories, we are left not with a single answer, but with a spectrum of possibilities, each compelling, each incomplete. If we accept the supernatural explanation, the Desert Widow is a ghost or a collective of spirits bound to the Taklamakan Desert by trauma, ritual, or unfinished business. The mass grave discovered in 2016 supports this interpretation. The women buried there died violently, possibly unjustly, and were subjected to post-mortem rituals meant to suppress their voices. If we believe that trauma can leave an echo in a place, then the Desert Widow may be that echo, a psychic residue that manifests as song, drawing the living into the same fate that claimed the dead. This interpretation aligns with the consistent elements of the legend: the singing, the compulsion, the association with mourning and loss. It also explains why the phenomenon persists despite modernization. Ghosts, if they exist, are not bound by time or technology. They are bound by place and emotion. If we reject the supernatural and look for a psychological explanation, The Desert Widow becomes a shared hallucination, a culturally transmitted narrative that primes travelers to interpret natural phenomena as paranormal. The harsh environment of the Taklamakan, combined with isolation, stress, and the power of suggestion, creates the conditions for mass hysteria. The reason the descriptions are consistent is because the story itself is consistent, passed down through generations and reinforced every time someone claims to have heard the singing. But this explanation requires us to dismiss the physical evidence, the recordings, the graves, the bodies found in the desert, as coincidence or misinterpretation. It asks us to believe that hundreds of people, across cultures and centuries, independently experienced the same delusion. It's possible, but it strains credibility. A third interpretation lies between the supernatural and the psychological. The idea that the Desert Widow is a natural phenomenon that has been mythologized. The desert hum, infrasound, toxic dust, and extreme environmental conditions could combine to create experiences that feel supernatural but have physical causes. The singing could be wind. The compulsion could be disorientation. The vision of a woman could be a heat-induced hallucination shaped by cultural expectations. This interpretation is the most scientifically defensible, but it also feels incomplete. It explains the mechanism, but not the meaning. It tells us how people might hear singing, but not why they all hear the same song. It accounts for the hallucination, but not for the bodies found crawling toward the ruins, or the graves of women whose skulls were deliberately altered to silence them. Perhaps the truth is that the Desert Widow is all of these things. A real event, the execution of women whose voices were feared, mythologized into legend, reinforced by natural phenomena, and kept alive by the genuine terror of those who ventured into the desert and returned, changed. She is history, psychology, and mystery, woven together so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. What we can say with certainty is this: the Taklamakan Desert is a place where the past refuses to die. Whether the Desert Widow is a ghost, a legend, or a warning, she has endured because she represents something fundamental about human fear, the fear of being lost, of being forgotten, of being drawn into something beautiful and finding only death. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Altan Yavuz traveled to the Taklamakan to investigate the Desert Widow legend firsthand. Yavuz had spent years researching Silk Road mysteries and was a self-described skeptic. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence. Yavuz's plan was to spend a week camping near the Lulan ruins, using audio recording equipment, night vision cameras, and environmental sensors to capture any unusual phenomena. He hired local guides, all of whom warned him against the plan. They told him the same stories travelers had told for centuries: the singing, the widow, the men who never came back. Yavuz thanked them for the folklore and proceeded anyway. For the first 3 nights, nothing happened. Yavuz recorded hours of wind, sand, and silence. His equipment detected no anomalies. He began to believe that the legend was exactly what he suspected: a story, nothing more. On the 4th night, Yavuz's cameras captured something. The footage, which Yavuz uploaded to his archive before disappearing, shows him sitting by a campfire, reviewing notes. The timestamp reads 2:37 a.m. At 2:41 a.m., the audio picks up a faint sound, distant, rhythmic, melodic. Yavuz looks up. He tilts his head, listening. Then he stands. He does not say anything. He does not grab his camera or his equipment. He simply walks away from the fire, toward the ruins. The camera, fixed in place, continues recording. Yavuz disappears into the darkness. The audio continues to pick up the singing, growing louder, clearer. It is a woman's voice. It is beautiful. At 3:14 a.m., the audio stops. The camera records until sunrise. Yavuz does not return. A search party found his campsite 2 days later. The equipment was still running. The footage was intact, but Yavuz was gone. His guides reported finding his footprints leading into the desert, toward the ruins, and then nothing. The tracks ended abruptly, as if he had simply stopped walking and vanished. To this day, Altan Yavuz has not been found. His footage remains the most compelling modern evidence of the Desert Widow phenomenon, and the most disturbing, because unlike the travelers of the past, Yavuz knew the legend. He knew the danger. He went prepared, armed with technology and skepticism, and still, he walked into the desert and did not come back. If you want more unsolved history, comment your theory, and subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. The Desert Widow is not just a legend. She is a question that the desert refuses to answer. She is the intersection of history and myth, of evidence and belief, of the known and the unknowable. She is the voice that calls from the ruins, the figure that stands at the edge of the firelight, the song that no one should follow but that everyone hears. The early Turkish traders who swore they heard her were not lying. They were not hallucinating. They were bearing witness to something that exists in the space between explanation and experience, a phenomenon so persistent, so specific, and so terrifying that it has survived the collapse of empires, the passage of centuries, and the scrutiny of science. We may never know who the Desert Widow was in life. We may never understand why her song still echoes across the sands. But we know this. The Taklamakan Desert holds secrets that it does not give up willingly. And those who go looking for answers must be prepared for the possibility that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, because the desert does not forget. And neither does she. If you listen closely on a still night, when the wind dies and the dunes fall silent, you might hear it. A voice, distant and sweet, singing a song in a language no one remembers. And if you do, turn away. Walk back to the fire. Do not follow, because the desert is full of those who did, and they are still singing. In 2003, a breakthrough occurred that had been buried in bureaucracy for over 50 years. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese historian specializing in Silk Road documentation, gained access to previously classified Soviet archives in Almaty, Kazakhstan. What she discovered would add a deeply unsettling chapter to the Desert Widow investigation. The archives contained field reports from a 1953 Soviet geological expedition that had been tasked with surveying mineral deposits in the Taklamakan region. The expedition was led by Colonel Dmitry Volkov, a decorated officer with no prior interest in folklore or the paranormal. His reports were clinical, methodical, and focused entirely on geological data, until the entry dated August 19, 1953. At approximately 0230 hours, Sergeant Petrov reported hearing vocalizations emanating from Grid Section 7 Delta, near the ruins designated Site 23. I initially dismissed this as auditory fatigue. However, when Corporal Mikhailov independently reported identical phenomena 30 minutes later, I authorized investigation. Upon approach to Site 23, all 5 team members confirmed hearing what can only be described as female singing. The source could not be located. Compass readings became erratic within 50 meters of the ruins. 2 men, Petrov and Sokolov, attempted to proceed beyond the perimeter established. The report continues with increasingly detailed observations over the following 3 nights. Volkov notes that the singing occurred at the same time each night, lasting between 40 and 70 minutes. On August 22nd, the expedition was abruptly terminated. The final entry in Volkov's report is stark. Sokolov is missing. Last seen 0320 hours, walking toward Site 23. Search initiated at dawn. No trace found. But the most chilling detail comes from an addendum, dated September 1953, written after the team had returned to Moscow. Volkov describes being called into a meeting with NKVD officials who questioned him extensively about the expedition. He was told that his report would be classified and that he was not to discuss the incident with anyone. The reason, according to the officials, was that Site 23 had been flagged in multiple previous reports dating back to the 1920s, reports that described identical phenomena, always involving auditory anomalies and personnel disappearances. The NKVD had known about the Desert Widow for decades, and they had been documenting it. Dr. Tanaka's discovery prompted her to search for additional records. She found them, scattered across archives in Moscow, Beijing, and Tashkent. Between 1924 and 1991, at least 14 separate Soviet and Chinese expeditions reported unexplained phenomena in the same region of the Taklamakan. 7 of those expeditions resulted in personnel disappearances. In every case, the missing individuals were last seen or heard moving toward ancient ruins, and in every case, witnesses reported hearing singing in the hours before the disappearance. The pattern was undeniable. The Desert Widow was not a legend confined to medieval merchants and superstitious locals. She was affecting trained military personnel, scientists, and government officials, people who had no cultural connection to the legend and every reason to be skeptical. Comment Archive. If you think this evidence should have been public all along, what makes the Soviet reports particularly significant is their standardization. Unlike merchant journals or traveler accounts, which vary in detail and reliability, the Soviet reports were written according to strict military protocols. They include GPS coordinates, timestamps, environmental data, and witness statements. When analyzed collectively, they reveal something extraordinary. The phenomena occur in a geographically concentrated area, roughly 15 square kilometers surrounding the Lulin ruins, and they follow a temporal pattern. Most incidents occur between midnight and 4 a.m., with peak activity around 2:30 a.m. This consistency suggests that whatever is happening is not random. It is localized and cyclical, behaving more like a natural phenomenon than a supernatural haunting. But natural phenomena do not cause compass malfunctions. They do not create audio recordings of rhythmic interference patterns, and they certainly do not compel trained soldiers to walk into the desert and vanish without a trace. In 2009, Dr. Tanaka collaborated with Dr. Isaac Morales, an American physicist specializing in electromagnetic anomalies. Together, they proposed a radical hypothesis that the Desert Widow phenomenon might be related to naturally occurring electromagnetic fields generated by the unique geology of the Taklamakan. The region sits atop ancient tectonic formations rich in magnetite and other ferromagnetic minerals. Under certain conditions, temperature gradients, seismic microactivity, atmospheric pressure changes, these minerals could generate localized electromagnetic fields strong enough to affect human neurology. Morales pointed to research showing that exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies can induce auditory hallucinations, feelings of presence, and compulsive behavior. He suggested that the singing might be a neurological interpretation of electromagnetic stimulation, and that the compulsion to follow it might be a form of electromagnetic hyperstimulation affecting the brain's motor control centers. The theory is elegant, scientifically plausible, and deeply unsettling. Because if true, it means the Desert Widow is not a ghost. She is a trap built into the desert itself, a geological predator that uses electromagnetic fields to lure human prey. It would explain why the phenomenon is localized, why it follows temporal patterns, and why it affects people regardless of their cultural background or belief system. But it also raises a question that Morales could not answer. If the phenomenon is purely electromagnetic, why do witnesses consistently describe a woman? Why not a man, an animal, or an abstract presence? Why is the hallucination so specific, so universal, so tied to the image of a widow in white? In 2021, a woman named Aisha Kadir came forward with a story that had haunted her for over 30 years. Kadir, now in her 60s, had worked as a translator for a Chinese archaeological expedition in the Taklamakan in 1988. She had never spoken publicly about what happened on that expedition until the discovery of Altan Yavuz's footage prompted her to break her silence. Kadir's account, recorded in a series of interviews with researcher Dr. Michael Chen, provides the most detailed first-person description of a Desert Widow encounter ever documented. Unlike most witnesses who describe the experience in fragmented, traumatic terms, Kadir's memory is remarkably clear. She remembers everything. The expedition had been surveying burial sites near Meran when, on the fifth night, the team's camp was struck by a sudden sandstorm. The storm was brief but violent, and when it passed, one of the archaeologists, a young man named Wei, was found standing at the edge of camp, staring into the desert. He was humming. "At first, we thought he was just shaken by the storm," Kadir recalled. "But then we realized he wasn't humming randomly. It was a melody, a very specific melody." Wei did not respond when spoken to. He continued humming, his eyes fixed on the ruins in the distance. Two team members tried to physically move him, but he resisted with surprising strength. Eventually, they managed to get him into a tent, where he sat in silence for the rest of the night, still humming the same melody. The next morning, Wei seemed to have recovered. He had no memory of the storm or the humming. But that night, the entire camp heard it, the singing. Kadir describes it as not loud, but impossible to ignore. 3 team members, including Wei, stood up and began walking toward the sound. Kadir and the others tried to stop them, but it was like trying to restrain sleepwalkers. The 3 men were calm, almost serene, but completely unresponsive. They had to be tied down. For the next 2 hours, the singing continued. Kadir describes it as the saddest thing I have ever heard. It was mourning, but it was also calling. It wanted us to come. When the singing finally stopped, the 3 men collapsed as if a switch had been turned off. They woke hours later with no memory of the event. But Kadir remembered something else, something she had seen while the others were focused on restraining the men. "I looked toward the ruins," she said, "and I saw her. She was standing between 2 broken pillars, maybe 200 meters away. She was wearing white. Her hair was long and dark, and even though it was night, even though there was no moon, I could see her face clearly." Kadir paused during the interview, visibly shaken even 3 decades later. "I knew if I took one step toward her, I would never stop walking. And I knew she knew it too." We looked at each other for maybe 10 seconds. Then she turned and walked deeper into the ruins. The expedition left the next day. Kadir never returned to the Taklamakan. For years, she tried to rationalize what she had seen: hallucination, exhaustion, suggestion. But she could never reconcile one detail. The next morning, before they left, she walked to the spot where she had seen the woman standing. The sand there was smooth, undisturbed by wind. And in the center of that smooth sand were footprints, small, barefoot, human. They led deeper into the ruins and then stopped, as if the person who made them had simply vanished. If this testimony convinced you something real is happening in that desert. In the year 330 BCE, the Silent Watcher, if it truly existed and continued its vigil, would have observed something unprecedented: the systematic destruction of everything it had spent 2 centuries watching over. Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king who had conquered most of the known world by age 26, arrived at Persepolis with his army. What followed was not mere conquest, it was annihilation. The historical record of Persepolis's fall is relatively well documented from the Greek side, though Persian sources for this period are virtually non-existent. The palace complex that had taken decades to build, that had stood as the symbol of Persian power and divine order, burned for 3 days. Whether the fire was deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, or a drunken accident at a victory celebration, remains debated. What is not debated is that the flames consumed the cedar beams, melted the gold ornaments, and cracked the limestone columns with heat so intense that some stones show vitrification even today. Did the silent watcher observe this final catastrophe? If its purpose was to record the deeds of the empire, surely this ultimate deed, the empire's death, would have drawn its attention. But there is no record. The systematic documentation of guard reports ended with the collapse of the administrative system. The priests who might have noted supernatural phenomena were scattered or killed. The continuity was broken. However, there is one tantalizing fragment. Plutarch, writing centuries later but claiming to draw on sources closer to the events, describes Alexander's final night in Persepolis before his army departed. Could Alexander, in the ruins of the palace, have felt the gaze of the watcher? If the entity was indeed recording cosmic justice, the fall of Persepolis would have been a moment of supreme significance, the culmination of whatever cycle it had been observing. The young conqueror, standing in the ashes of an empire, might have felt for a moment what the Persian guards had felt regularly, the unsettling awareness of being seen by something that should not be there. The immediate aftermath of the destruction scattered the Persian elite. Many fled east, attempting to continue resistance under Darius III and his successors. Others accommodated themselves to Macedonian rule. The vast bureaucracy that had administered the empire, including the scribes who had documented the Watcher sightings, was dissolved. The institutional knowledge was lost. But the memory persisted among the common people and the priests of the Zoroastrian temples. When the Seleucid dynasty, Alexander's successors in the region, attempted to rebuild elements of Persian governance, they did not attempt to reoccupy Persepolis. The ceremonial capital remained ruins. Some scholars have suggested this was simply because the Seleucids preferred other locations, but Persian sources hint at another reason. The place was considered troubled, a location where the spiritual order had been disrupted so violently that it could not be restored. The Sasanian Empire, which arose in the 3rd century CE and consciously tried to revive Achaemenid traditions, regarded Persepolis as a sacred site but did not attempt to rebuild it. Sasanian inscriptions at the site honor the ancient kings, but describe the ruins themselves as a place of memory and warning. One inscription, attributed to the high priest Cartier, refers to the Watchers of the Broken Heights, in a context that suggests he believed the spiritual guardians of the old empire remained, trapped perhaps, unable to leave even though their charge was destroyed. This belief, that spiritual entities associated with a place might remain bound to it even after the place's purpose is gone, appears in various traditions. Japanese Buddhism speaks of muenbotoke, spirits attached to locations where they died or had strong connections, unable to move on. Christian traditions include stories of ghosts bound to ruins, endlessly repeating actions that no longer have meaning. If the Silent Watcher was such an entity, bound by cosmic duty to observe Persepolis, its fate after the burning is tragic. Still performing its function of observation, but now with nothing to observe except decay, wind-blown dust, and the occasional traveler picking through the ruins for treasures. An eternal sentinel standing watch over nothing, unable to comprehend that the empire it chronicled has ceased to exist. Medieval Islamic travelers to the ruins of Persepolis left accounts that occasionally mention unusual experiences. This is an interesting phrase, not fear of ghosts or demons, but sadness, an emotional quality attributed to the place itself. Could this sadness be a faint echo of what the old Persian woman described to Theseus? A sadness in the shape of a man? If the Watcher still walked the broken rooftops, still performing its function of observation centuries after there was anything of significance to observe, that would indeed be the saddest story of all, a being of purpose, continuing its duty in a world where that duty no longer has meaning. European travelers of the 17th and 18th centuries, rediscovering Persepolis for the Western world, left accounts focused on the architectural grandeur and deciphering the inscriptions. However, there are occasional odd notes. Pietro della Valle, An Italian traveler who visited in 1621 mentions that his local guides refused to camp among the ruins, preferring to sleep at a distance. When pressed, they said the site was watched. The archaeological excavations of the 20th century brought modern science to Persepolis, but also uncovered new mysteries. Ernst Herzfeld, during his pioneering excavations in the 1930s, kept detailed journals. While most entries are strictly archaeological, there are scattered personal observations. Herzfeld was a sober scientific investigator, not prone to fancy. The fact that he noted this experience, albeit in his personal journal rather than official reports, suggests it was strong enough to warrant acknowledgement. Other members of the excavation team, according to memoirs published decades later, occasionally mentioned similar feelings, though always in ambiguous terms that might be dismissed as imagination. In 1971, the Shah of Iran held a massive celebration at Persepolis to commemorate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. Thousands of guests, including numerous heads of state, camped near the ruins in specially constructed pavilions. The event was a spectacular display of Iranian cultural pride and historical continuity. However, several security personnel from that event, interviewed years later after the Islamic Revolution, described persistent difficulties with personnel refusing night shifts near the ancient structures. The official explanation was discomfort with the historical site's spiritual significance, but the language used by the guards themselves was more specific. They felt watched. These modern accounts are, of course, heavily influenced by knowledge of the ancient legends. Once a place has a reputation for supernatural phenomena, the power of suggestion ensures continued reports. Skeptics would argue that any unusual feeling among the ruins is simply the psychological effect of being in an evocative historical site, combined with cultural narratives about the watcher. Yet the consistency persists. Across cultures and centuries, people who spend time at Persepolis, particularly at night, report similar experiences: a sense of observation, an emotional quality of sadness or solemnity, an awareness of presence that cannot be directly perceived. These reports are too anecdotal, too subjective to constitute evidence of anything supernatural. But they are also too consistent to dismiss as purely random imagination. If we accept, even hypothetically, that something the ancient Persian guards witnessed was real, whether spiritual entity, unknown natural phenomenon, or something else entirely, then we must ask, when did it end? Did the destruction of the palace release it from its duty? Did it fade away as the empire it watched over faded into history? Or does it continue, a relic from an ancient cosmic order, still performing a function that no longer has relevance, still walking rooftops that long ago collapsed? The poignancy of this possibility is striking. The greatest empires become ruins. The mightiest kings become dust. The most sophisticated civilizations are forgotten. But if there are beings whose purpose is to observe and record, what becomes of them when there is nothing left to observe? Do they move on to new subjects? Or do they remain, bound by duty or nature to locations that have lost all significance, eternal witnesses to emptiness? Standing in the ruins of Persepolis today, surrounded by broken columns that once supported roofs where something walked, it is difficult not to feel the weight of time, the melancholy of lost grandeur, and perhaps, just perhaps, the sensation of being observed by something that has watched this slow decay for over 2,000 years, still waiting, still recording, still performing its lonely vigil over an empire of ghosts. The story of the silent watcher did not end with the fall of Persepolis, nor did it remain confined to Iran. As the tale passed through centuries and across cultures, it evolved, influenced new narratives, and became part of a broader tradition of mystery that continues to resonate in the modern world. The legacy of the Watcher is found not in definitive answers, but in the questions it forces us to confront about observation, memory, and the things that persist beyond understanding.